Welcome to the Hope After Child Loss podcast, where we endeavor to offer stories of hope to grieving parents and siblings so that they might rediscover a life filled with meaning, purpose, and hope. We invite you to come and join us. Hello. Welcome to another episode of the Hope After Child Loss podcast. I'm your host, Greg Buffkin, and we are really glad that you could join us today. So guys, my guest today is Tristan Borland. He and his wife, Jill, have recently been named directors of Smile Again Ministries up in Cross Lake, Minnesota. So Tristan, I wanted to welcome you to the podcast. So glad you could join us today.
Hey, thanks, Greg. Good to be here.
Good, man. Well, listen, why don't you take a couple of minutes and just tell us a little bit about yourself before we dive into your story?
Pastor up in central Minnesota, and I've been serving up in this area for, I've been lead pastor at the church I'm currently at for about 12 and a half years. And this last year, my wife and I have been kind of sensing a big change. And so we resigned from our position. Love our church. We love our people. Is a good spot, but just sense the Holy Spirit moving us into something else. And so we resigned not knowing what we were going to do. And about 24 hours later, this position about 30 miles from where we lived opened up at Smile Again Ministries. So we're directing this new ministry. It is a lodge and retreat center for primarily parents and families who've lost children as they go through grief. And so we are diving into a new life right now. And as I tell a lot of my friends, we so far this year we got a puppy, and then we found out Jill is expecting another baby, and I quit my job. So we're in lots of transitions right now, but things are good, and we're excited about the new work we're a part of. So,
oh well, that is some good work. That kind of outreach to grieving parents and siblings. There's not a lot of that out there, actually. So really glad to hear that some young people are stepping into a role like that. And you bring a lot of experience to that role as a pastor, and probably more so because you're a parent and because you've experienced the devastating loss of a child.
Yeah, that's right. So we're parents to, we're expecting our seventh child now. But yeah, you're right. So about 7.5 years ago, our third daughter, Maria, did die. She was almost 4 years old, and we lost her back in 2016. So went through that devastating loss while pastoring, and we were, loved very well where we were in the church. But my wife and I walked through that devastating loss, and now sense God calling us to walk with others in the midst of their loss and their grief.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to do because, your own grief can be so raw at times. And as you have conversations with others who have lost a child, it can open those floodgates again and bring back so many memories of your own from that time that was so fresh. And it doesn't really seem to matter how much time goes by. It's just the way it works.
Yeah, and we're new into the work, and so we're just kind of experiencing that right now because we just started really at the beginning of the summer. Yeah, and it's been good so far. But yeah, we're kind of navigating what does that look like to walk with other parents who've been devastated by their own losses, and definitely sharing about what we've been through. And it's definitely emotional, isn't it? It's an emotional and a kind of a heavy kind of thing. But again, we sense this is where God's placed us, and there's both good in it, but also, reliving our sorrow. That's true.
Yeah, it is heavy, but I've told so many people since I started doing this podcast, Tristan, I've met so many amazing people who all have lost a child. And it's so cool to see what God is doing in the aftermath of that, after they've had a chance to heal and had an opportunity to really think about, is there something that God wants me to do to help other parents? And so many have done that. Others can't. And that's okay. We're not all called to do that. But it is an amazing responsibility. And, for me, getting to meet people like you and others that I've interviewed, it's such a blessing to me, because it's a difficult subject without question.
Mm-hmm.
It's a heavy subject, but, it really is uplifting and encouraging to me just to see people like you who have been impacted by the absolute unimaginable losing a child to a place where you are now, where you can experience joy and hope and meaning and purpose again. And, that journey doesn't happen quickly, but the stories that I get to hear are just amazing. And I know people are looking forward to hearing yours as well today. I'd like for you to, as you start your story, Tristan, tell us about your sweet little Maria.
So Maria was our third born. We had 3 straight girls. Actually, we had 5 straight girls. And Maria was by far, at least at her age, I mean, she was just almost 4 years old when she died, but she was by far the strongest willed. And just a spitfire, very very strong, but just a joy in our life. And so our oldest daughter, Jovi, was like compliant from the day she was born. She was the kid that when you had the kid, you're just like, we're such good parents because look at how good she is. And I just thought that was our own amazing parenting abilities. And then we had Tana, and Tana was a little bit tougher, but still pretty good. And then we had Maria, and we realized like we had done nothing good with the older ones. It was just, I don't know, personality or easy kids to raise. And Maria was just, she was strong, but she was good. And normal childhood. I mean, our girls are, our fourth daughter, Sadie, was born just 17 months after Maria. So we had like one girl right after another. And so we had a very busy, full life, pastoring full time, a bunch of little girls. And we were expecting our 5th child in the winter of 2016. And Maria was almost 4 years old at the time. And she came down with just a everyday virus. She had been sick for a few days. Nothing apparently wrong with her. And like there was anything out of the ordinary. She had no chronic illness, no major genetic anything that we know of. And so we were kind of par for the course. And so we were playing a game at the kitchen table with the older girls. We were just sitting around, and my wife and I and our older 2 girls were playing a game. And Sadie would have been just a baby at the time. And Maria was laying on the couch, and she called for me to take her to bed. And so I picked her up and I carried her into the room, and I was laying her in her bed, and she gasped, and her heart stopped. And I won't go into too many more details of that evening. I'll talk about just about anything, and we can share just about everything, but it's hard to relive those moments. Tried CPR, first responders came, and they just weren't able to revive her. And so yeah, just all of a sudden, the way I describe it is you wake up in one world where life is normal and everything is going along the way you would expect it to be. And by the end of that day, your entire world is turned upside down, and just utter shock. Yeah. So that became the journey of loss and grieving Maria's death and figuring out what that meant for us as a family, and just walking through tragedy.
For those of you that are listening today, Tristan and Jill started writing a book not long after they lost Maria. It is an amazing little book, and its title is A Life After Death. And in the 8 years since my wife and I lost our son, I think I can honestly say I haven't read anything like this book, in that it probably gives the best glimpse into the world of grieving parent the most accurate, the most transparent, and probably the rawest look of anything that I've read, to a point that Tristan just made a minute ago. In the book, he talks about how the death of a parent's child marks time and divides time like nothing else. In other words, for that grieving parent, there is time before your child's death, and then there's time, the new beginning, as it were, marking the time since their child's death. And Tristan, I wanted you to talk a little bit about that, because I think that's something every parent, every grieving parent experiences. Some know how to put it into words like that. Others may not, but I think when they read that, they instantly understand. And those who are on the outside, who haven't lost a child, probably really don't have a clue what that means. So I'd like for you to speak to that.
Yeah, well, thank you for those kind words, Greg. Our book, just real quick, it really, we didn't set out to write a book. It was really just, as a pastor, we were kind of in the public eye. We're in a small town, kind of everybody knows who we are. And so I was just stuck with what do I communicate? How, like, people want to know what's going on in our lives. We just suffered this tragic, unexpected loss, delve into our own grief, and to communicate with the greater community around us. And then eventually, it was actually about 5 years after that, we decided to put it together and publish something. So it was more just like a communication to our friends, our family, the people in our church, of like just how we're doing, what are we experiencing. And yeah, it is pretty raw. It's definitely, as I put in the introduction, this is not a pastor's book on how to get over grief. It's more of just our own personal suffering, and it's not a how-to thing. It's just our experience, because every grief is unique.
Christian, let me jump in there and just comment on that. I think that's one of the things that's touched me so deeply, and that meant so much to me personally, is that the fact that you didn't try to write this book, either you or Jill, from the perspective of being a pastor or a pastor's wife, but it was written from the perspective of a grieving mom and dad.
Yeah.
And you just simply spoke to those roles that I think probably would surprise people, because they would kind of expect that a pastor would, I mean this when I say this very respectfully, that sometimes I think we expect that a pastor might try to put spiritual Band-Aids or scriptural Band-Aids on something that's a very deep wound. And you didn't do that. You simply spoke from the perspective of somebody who was hurting and whose world had been turned upside down.
Yeah. And it's not as if we didn't lose our faith. We didn't lose our faith, or we didn't.
Right.
But it was just honesty. Like I'm not trying to give answers. We're just trying to sort this out in our own life and in our own wrestling with what it means to continue to follow God in the midst of devastation and tragedy. And so I think we just tried to observe what was going on in our home, what was going on in our hearts and our minds, and to do so honestly before God, but not to use cliches and simple answers, because there are no simple answers, right? I mean, like,
no.
Every personal suffering, every loss of a child is devastating in and of itself, and I don't know. So that's where we were coming from. To speak to the time thing, 'cause it's been a while since I've thought about this, Greg, but yeah, I mean, when you lose a child, it does seem that it changes your perception of time. Maybe the best analogy would be when you have a child, it changes when you become a parent, right? I think so. Maybe a parent who has not lost a child can think about, it's hard. I don't know if you remember this, Greg, but like after your kids are in your life for a while, it's hard to remember when you weren't a parent, right? Because that idea of bringing a child into your home and the joy of this new child, and it's like, what was life like when I used to sleep, and when I,
Right.
what was life like whenever I could be selfish all the time? I didn't have these children, but having a child so fundamentally changes us. I think in such a good way. I think this is how God's created us in
So
such a
true.
beautiful way. But in just such a devastating way, to lose a child is just such a marker. And so, yeah, for years, I mean, we even now, 7 years later, we'll say things like, oh yeah, that was before Maria died, because it was like, there was like a different life back then. It was,
Yeah.
going through grave loss, it just fundamentally changes you. And so, and I don't know, that's true for us, and it's true for anybody who's lost, I'm sure. But it just becomes this marker that is so distinct in the life of the individual. So,
We found that to be true in our lives,
Yeah.
without question. And I think it would be an impossibility for it not to mark your life like that.
Yeah.
Time as we know it, our calendars are marked. I mean, we're in the time period known as AD. There was a BC.
Mm-hmm.
So the birth and life and death of Jesus changed time from before and after. And so we're familiar with that. But I think unless you've lost a child, it's a little bit hard maybe to wrap your head around that. But man, is it ever true? And that was a great analogy you used about before and after children coming into your life. Something else that, you alluded to in the book, I want people to have a better understanding of, because one of the things that we hope to do on this podcast is two things. We want to talk about the reality of life after losing a child. And we also want to, through these shared stories, to offer hope to parents who have lost a child. And so I like to offer glimpses into what our world is like in the aftermath of losing a child. And one of the things that you address in your book is grief makes all the little things difficult. You remember writing that?
I do.
Let's talk about that, because I think that's something that people really don't understand. So let's talk a little bit about some of those little things that become so difficult, that are just, for other people, it's what they do every day and they don't even think about it, right?
Yeah, that's good, Greg. I think when you go through such a overwhelming tragedy, it just becomes like the air you breathe. It's all around you. And I just remember for us, just for months on months, just this cloud over everything. It was like all we could think about is this precious little girl who we loved with all our heart was with us, and she's gone. And just it changed everything in our life. One of the things Jill and I had a hard time doing is this: we were very future minded, always thinking about the future, always making plans. And for several years, it just felt like it's hard to talk about the future, because every future plan had included all of our children.
Right.
And so every kind of like of course, holidays are the worst. And so you think about Christmas, and it's like, all you can think about is just, she's not here. Maria's gone. She was supposed to be here. We loved her. And so for us, just that act of surviving is, I think, so common among people who grieve, who've lost greatly, right? Just how do you keep on living? Part of our story, it's kind of where we, the name of the book, A Life After Death, is a little bit of a play on words. But for us, Jill was 9 months pregnant when we lost Maria. So our fifth daughter was on the way. How do you
do that, Tristan?
Oh man, I was just thinking about Maria. This was going to be the child that she was going to remember as a baby, because Sadie was born 17 months after her. So she was so excited to meet her little sister.
Oh.
And so she was going to be the big sister this time. And we have a video like 1 week before, the girls are all talking about the baby who's about to be born. And then Maria dies suddenly. and we're planning the funeral and just dealing with all those unthinkable things that you have to deal with as a parent who's lost a child. And Jill's water broke the day before the funeral.
Oh,
so we're driving to the hospital, and the first phone call we make isn't to family or friends, or it's to our funeral director saying, hey, we're going to have to postpone the funeral. And so we go to the hospital, and of all of our children being born, I just remember walking the halls and just I couldn't think about this new child. All I could just think about is our little girl that we had just lost, and just the suffering of that. And Jill's labor and delivery have all been fairly, I got to be careful here, Greg, with you and I talking. They've all been fairly short. As I don't know what else to say. We're going to get ourselves in trouble with the audience here.
Be very careful.
But her labors and deliveries have all been, 6 or 7 hours, pretty routine as far as that goes. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, pretty routine as far as that goes. But this labor drug on and on and on and on, because I think Jill was just still in shock from the last week of losing Maria, and just physically the kind of toll that takes on a person. So
yeah,
and so just this idea of welcoming a new child into the world, and I walked those halls of a hospital like a ghost. I knew theoretically this new child would be born and we'd love this child, but all I could think about is the girl that we were waiting to bury.
Yeah.
And man, it's like everything is like unthinkable after a child. Now, praise God, Lucy was born, and Lucy's now 7 years old. She's a delight. We love her deeply. She's great.
Yeah.
But to be honest with you, Greg, on the day she was born, the only thing I could really feel was just like, well, I'm glad she's here. But all I could think about was our daughter that we lost. It was Maria.
Yeah.
And Jill, I think, because she had been carrying Lucy for 9 months, had that motherly bond with her daughter, and but then we went, and 2 days later had a funeral.
Wow.
Yeah. So
this is probably, without question, the most unique story I have ever heard. Not that you had a choice, but man, I don't know how parents get through something like that. I do know. Let me back up.
Yeah.
I know how you guys got through it because you guys have a relationship with the Lord. That's how you got through it. But still, that was like a knife through the heart. At the same time, you're excited about this new child, and to celebrate and to grieve all at the same time. That's a difficult position to be in. I can only imagine.
Well, on a practical level, in some ways, we were very fortunate. I mean, I think of parents that have one child and lose a child. I think every it's hard to compare. And so, whether unique or not,
right.
the reality was for us, like when you just want to lay in bed all day, you had to get up and feed a baby. When you're you can't even face the world. You got other kids to care for, and like it was almost like we were forced to love and continue to love and serve
right.
the ones we had, which was really good practical reminder. And our book is very bleak. And I remember like blogging to our friends and family saying like, if this is the only, 6 months later, if this is the only glimpse you have into our life, you're going to think we're just terribly depressed and horribly sad all the time. I'm like, but no, we're writing about that, but we're still living, right? We're still getting up and trying to, and thankfully the joy of our family and our church and our friends, like we were super well supported. And so even though we were going through this devastating thing of losing a child and then having a birth, we had to keep living, right? We had to keep being faithful with what we were called to do. And so, yeah.
Right. I mean, even in the simple things, trip to the grocery store, I think encapsulates one of those ordinary things in life that we have to do. You got to go to the grocery store, unless you just want to give up eating.
Yes.
So before you lose a child, you don't think twice about going to the grocery store. And this is just one example. I remember after we lost Ryan, that was something Kathy, my wife, could not bring herself to do. I could do it, but it was incredibly difficult because you feel like you're that parent walking around in the grocery store that everybody knows that's the guy who just lost his child, or even worse, they're going about their ordinary daily routines and don't have a clue what happened in your life. And you're left with your thoughts, and you walk up to the checkout and somebody says, "Hey, how are you?" And you're thinking, well, if you had a couple of 3 hours, I could tell you, but you probably really don't want to know how I'm doing. So it's just little ordinary things like that, right?
Oh man, it is. And I mean, I think a lot of parents struggle with this of like, what do you say? Right?
Yeah.
Like, do you just say like, "Oh yeah, I'm fine," because you just want to get out of the store?
Exactly.
And my friends always like make fun of me because I'm the guy who's just going to say it anyway, which is just horribly awkward at times,
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, like, I don't know, you love your child, and even though the world didn't stop, right? People have their lives, people do their things. You're not the center of the universe. It's like your world has stopped.
Yeah.
And it's hard to know how to re-enter into the normal world in any kind of normal way, right?
Yeah, that is so well put.
And so I would often be the guy who said the awkward thing. I can tell it's 7 years later, so there's quite a bit of like restoration in my heart. But I remember going to Walmart, like, I don't know, 2 months after Maria's death, or within a month or two anyway. And to give Jill a break, I took baby Lucy with me. So I had to pick up groceries, drove down to Walmart, got the baby. I'm walking around just kind of in that fog, that just fog of like, it's just hard to survive. And this lady comes up to me and says, "Oh, such a cute little baby. Is that your first?" And I said, "No, it's our fifth." And of course, 5's a pretty large family these days. And so she made some, expletive and was like, "Oh, wow." And then I just look at her like, "Lady, like, I don't even know what to say to you right now." But I'm like, you don't even know. Like, I've got 5, but one of them's gone. And just, everything is just hard. And whether to say something or not say, it just is all complicated, right? And for parents that have lost children, it's just like you live in that state for, I don't know, forever, but at least for a long time of like, what do I say? How much do I say? What do I communicate? Everything's challenging. I don't know how you avoid that. I don't know how you avoid it.
Yeah, I'm not sure you can.
Yeah.
I think sometimes you feel like maybe you've gotten past that point, and then something happens. You bump into somebody that you haven't seen since you lost your child, and they ask about your child as though your child is still here.
Yeah.
And that just takes you back. I mean, it's sort of like a gut punch, and it just takes you back in time, and you're standing there, and all this is going through your mind in a split second. Do I tell them? Because if I do, I mean, we're standing here in the middle of the store. Are they, I don't know if I can do this or not. But,
right.
Because then if you do, they're standing there like a deer in the headlights.
Right.
Like, oh my gosh, what can of worms have I just opened?
Right. I was just here to get my milk, and now Greg's pouring his heart out to me in the grocery store. Yeah, it's just it's hard to know what to do, but you want to speak the truth. Yeah,
because they're feeling all awkward, and you're feeling awkward.
Exactly.
So it's just oh man, it's such a weird place to be at times.
Yeah,
and you said something a minute ago, and it's so true. When the funeral is over. That's when I think the reality really hits home, because everybody else, family members, friends, people that you work with, they leave the funeral, they go back to their homes, they go back to their offices, their schools, their workplaces, and they go back to their regular, routine, ordinary life. And your lives have just been turned upside down, and there's nothing ordinary or normal about it anymore. And that's when I think the grieving really begins, because you're in such a state of shock up until that point. Would you kind of agree with that?
Yeah. I think even, I know from my experience, the funeral, because I'm a pastor, and I kind of saw the funeral as an act of love for our daughter in some ways, of expression of our love for her. And so I kind of, in that week after she died, at least started thinking, okay, what do we do? How do we love her well in this? How do we serve her in some capacity, and honor God in this? And so when that was over, I was like, now what do I do? Like, I just didn't know what to do going forward. And everybody goes back home, and it's supposed to be normal, and it's just not. And
right.
Yeah.
And we don't come with an instruction book for facing stuff like this. I've talked to so many pastors who have said that, when they were in seminary, they don't have courses that teach them how to handle stuff like this. A pastor that I was talking with a few weeks ago made a really impactful comment. And he had just, I think within the last year or two, had lost his son. He said, we were not designed for death. When God created us, he created us for life. And that life was supposed to be an eternal life with him, without death in mind. And death was brought into the world by sin, by the fall. And so it's like one of those, the moment when it just kind of clicked, and like, well, dang, no wonder it feels so unnatural for people, and no wonder we don't know what to do with it, because it was not part of God's original design. And I had never thought about it that way.
Yeah, I mean, death is the final enemy, isn't it? I mean, it's to be conquered by Christ, and so it is not good. And so I think we like to, I don't know, use euphemisms to make it sound better, right? In fact, people like to, she passed on, or we tend to use heavenly language, but but death is awful. There's nothing good about death in and of itself, right?
Right.
God can redeem death, and God uses death for us. I don't know, this is again different for each person, but for me, it wasn't heaven so much that helped me. It was the suffering of Christ that kind of became my guide and my wife's guide, in that, not that, oh, everything's going to be okay someday. I do. Of course, I believe that. I'm a Christian. I believe in the resurrection. I believe in the hope that is to come.
Right.
But it was that God himself would suffer, that he would descend, that he would enter in, that in some ways our Creator understands our plight and our suffering.
Yes.
And for me, that was far more hopeful in my grief, in my loss, to think of God entering into this. And again, not apart from heaven, but it just, I don't know, that's what I hung my hat on, is that, that suffering is part of the Christian life because he suffered, that he calls us to partake in the life of Christ through entering in whatever our sufferings. Hopefully most people that are listening to this are not going to lose a child or whatever, but whatever the suffering is, that he has fully entered in. That to me was far more hopeful than ignoring the reality of death.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. And the kind of hope that we're talking about, Tristan, is, it's not a concept. It's not an abstract. It's not religion. That hope is a person, and that person is Jesus. He is hope. And he is our hope. He's the reason that we have hope in the aftermath of something so devastating and heartbreaking, because he conquered death, and in him we have new life.
And he truly suffered. I mean, like Psalm 22, which really was a psalm that I just went back to over and over again in the wake of Maria's death, is the cry of Christ on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? That the Son of God even cries out that he is forsaken And if you read Psalm 22, it's full of suffering language, but that God himself would take on suffering, which is a great mystery. I mean, we're not going to get to the bottom of this, but
right.
But that's where, like, for me, the hope was not so much my hope for Maria in heaven, which of course I hope for and I look to, but it was looking to God himself. Became more the hope. So exactly what you're saying, like Jesus is our hope. If Christ is resurrected, there is hope. But Christ also suffered.
Amen.
And so in our suffering, we look to his suffering, that he is not apart from us in our grief.
Right.
But he's with us.
Yeah. And it's recorded when his friend Lazarus died.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus was very emotional about that. Scripture records the shortest verse in Scripture. Jesus wept. So it's not that he was above that. He was fully man, so he suffered grief just like we did.
Yeah.
So he does understand what we're going through. There's another concept that we can pull out of Scripture. It talks about something that I want us to step into next, and that is the blessing and the benefit of having people in our lives. Those kind of people that you can call at 2:00 in the morning if you need to. Mm-hmm. Those people that are just treasures. So if you read, I know you're very familiar with this, but in the book of Job, it's a book about suffering and loss and grief. And after Job lost literally everything, his friends show up. And, they do it right. For 7 days, they do it right because they keep their mouths shut and they just sit there with him. And then at some point after that, they decide that they need to start giving him advice. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where they departed from doing the right thing. Yeah. And so I want us to talk about that because in your book, you talk about two very, very dear friends of yours, or people who become very dear friends. You knew who they were when Maria died, but you really got to know them in the aftermath because this was a couple that had also lost a child. I'm not sure how recently that happened before around the time of Maria's death, but I want you to talk about this couple because you spent a lot of time in your book talking about how much they helped you guys, particularly in that early season where you felt so alone. Mm-hmm. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah. We, I can't. There's always people in grief who say the wrong thing and goof it up, but I really can't. I can't share deeper gratitude for the people we had in our life. I mean, our church was fantastic. The people that said the weird thing or the awkward thing or that were like Job's friends, they were very much the minority. And so people were really good to us. We had a lot of good friends, but so I'll just speak. I don't want to tell their story.
Right.
But I'll share a little bit about Eric and Melanie, who are the people you're referring to. Eric and Melanie had lost a son in a pretty public tragedy. He was a kindergartner at the time, and this was I think about it would have been about 5 or 6 years before Maria died, and we weren't living in this community in Minnesota at the time, but we had been here before. And we didn't know them personally when their child died, but we were living in Michigan at the time. But because we knew people in the community, of course, we heard about this tragedy. It was really, really awful thing. And so we got to know Eric and Melanie a little bit just in the community after their son had died. We moved back to Minnesota. And so, and man, I learned some things in this season just as a pastor. So I'll tell you it was a Tuesday night. Some of our daughters were in like a young kids dance class, and Melanie, the mom of the one who had lost the son, she had a couple of daughters in the same dance class. And so we ended up sitting beside each other in a dance class with other parents and kids dancing and, just kind of putting in the time as a parent at a kids activity, waiting for your kids to be done. So as a good pastor in a community, I'm always good at talking with people. And so I was just sitting there talking to Melanie, who I knew from the community. And we were, not close friends, but we knew each other as families. I brought up, I said, hey, the 5K is coming up in commemoration of your son's life and his death this spring. I said, when is that? She started telling me about the 5K. And she said, Tristan, that's always a hard day. And I said, okay, tell me more about that. She says, well, it's just a lot of people come to this event and it's a good thing. The community, loves us, but it's just, I don't know, all these years seeing everybody and just, kind of reliving the grief.
Right.
And I started asking her about her son and about what it means to lose and just asking her questions. Right. And one of the things she said, it's funny, right? I'm a trained pastor. I've sat with people as they've died. I've walked. It was the first time in knowing her in 4 or 5 years that I ever asked her about her son. Mm-hmm. I was that guy who I don't want to make, of course, everybody knew that she had lost a son. I don't want to make her uncomfortable. It's that kind of mentality. I don't want to talk about, this. I don't want to be the awkward one. And so it was the first time I'd ever asked her. And then she said, Tristan, there are people that want us to go back to being the people we were before. Mm-hmm. And she's like, we can't. We are different now. And that's okay. We're okay being different. But some of the time it's hard in like in an event because, or different things. People we've changed. She was talking about how much they've changed. And then she was, tearing up and crying a little bit. And I, felt awkward. And so I said, Melanie, I don't want to make you cry. We're at dance class. There's other parents around. I don't want to be the weirdo. And she looked at me and she said, I cry all the time. You're not making me cry. I'm just glad you're asking me about my son. Mm-hmm. And for the first time as a pastor, I realized, of course she wants to talk about her son. I'm the awkward one. I'm the one who's not, I don't want to talk about it because I feel awkward. I don't know what to say. She loves her son. Of course she wants to talk about it. So this is a deeply profound conversation that we had. And I remember going home that night and I told Jill, I said, man, I ran into Melanie and we had this long conversation. Of course, I'm a pastor. I'm just connecting with people and loving people and serving. Maria got sick that night. She died 3 days. She died 3 days later. And, and then of course, because of the providential nature of this conversation, Eric and Melanie just became very natural people to walk with us in our grief. And
of course,
just showing up, they were ones that we could just, say anything to, and they totally obviously understood our situation, and have been good friends ever since.
Does walking through something like that with someone else, it really seals a relationship and a friendship like nothing else does. We found, because we have a couple in our lives like that who didn't know Ryan, but they stepped into our lives about 3 months later in a home Bible study that we were doing, and they just, I don't know, we just clicked with them unlike other people that we had known for years and years. And it's not to take away anything from those other relationships at all. It's just that they have stuck closer and have even made the comment, believe it or not, and they probably told us this 3 years ago, they both had daughters. Their names are David and Lacey, by the way. And they both had daughters, one from previous marriages. So neither one had a son. And they told us, Ryan, we feel like Ryan is the son that we never had. Mm. And they, talking about, what it is that people do to, like this couple that came into your lives. It's not always that they use, that there's special things that they said to you that just made an impact. It was the fact that they showed up. They gave you the gift of their presence.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's the practical things. This couple that I'm talking about, once a month, they go out to Ryan's grave and put fresh flowers out.
Mm.
Just little things like that, we were just blown away when we found out they did that.
It's those little things that you wouldn't even, I think before you lose, I wouldn't even think of like going out to the grave and putting flowers, but it's
me either.
So meaningful, like to be out there and to find this, right? And we find little things at Maria's grave, and just like the fact that somebody was out there and remembers, right?
Absolutely.
It's just like those little things that I was so clueless of, seven years ago. But what great gifts those friends are they?
They're treasures. Those don't come along very often.
Yeah.
Tristan, what is it about grief that you've learned since losing Maria that you didn't know before, that you wish people who have never experienced this understood better?
So what is something I've learned in grief?
About grief.
I don't know, Greg, because I guess I've thought a lot about loss prior to losing. In seminary, I remember I took a course on the problem of evil, wrestling with the suffering that is in the world, reading through Job, reading through this is the hardest question of the Christian faith, is if God is good and God is all powerful, why all of the tragedy, why all of the suffering? It is the hardest question for Christians to answer. And so I had a theological framework for all of these things. And as a pastor, I've sat by plenty of people as they died, as they so it wasn't as if I was naive to any of these things.
Sure.
But to go through it personally, and especially in an unexpected manner, doesn't matter how much you prepare yourself, right?
No, it doesn't.
I would say it's better to think about those things before you go through it. It's better to wrestle with the big questions before you're in the midst of it. So I'm grateful for that.
Right.
But I don't know. What have I learned? I don't know, Greg. I'm still learning. I'm still trying to figure it out.
That's okay.
Right? Yeah.
No, man, that's okay. I think it is that there is a learning curve that just goes on and on and on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess one of the hopeful things is to continue to love faithfully where you're called. One of the things, if you do read our book, I think it's dark in a lot of ways, or it's really sad. But if you lived in our house right now, 7 years later, I don't think you would see a darkness. We have a lot of joy because we have children and family and things to give ourselves to. That's one thing I would say is like great tragedy and joy are not mutually exclusive.
No, they are not. Absolutely.
Grief and joy can go together, and suffering and beauty are integrated into the same life, or can be integrated. And I think that's something we continue to try to do, and as we walk with Christ and walk with each other, is to have a joyful life. Despite the suffering. Yeah.
That is so well said, Tristan. And for whatever it's worth, as I read through your book, it didn't feel dark.
Good.
From someone who's been there, it just felt like, to me, Tristan and Jill get it. They understand where I've been, where my wife and I are, and from a perspective that very few people really understand unless they've walked here. So if you're listening and you think you might want to to entertain the thought of ordering this book, I would encourage you to do so. It's a relatively short book, just a little over 100 pages. And I think for me, it was encouraging, again, because I felt like I was reading something that another dad had written who had experienced exactly what I had experienced, just in a different set of circumstances, of course, but who understood me like nobody else did. So I personally am very appreciative of the fact that you guys were willing to sit down and spend the time investing, because you guys wrote this over the course of about 3 years or so, something like that, maybe longer.
Yeah, I think it was mostly in the first year or so, and then we just, we didn't intend to write a book, and
Right.
so it just kind of came about through that. And so there were some posts, or some of the mini chapters
Right.
that were later on after a few years, but yeah, it was over, and then we really edited it down. So I do think this is kind of funny. When, we've never published anything before. So when I was meeting with the publisher and I was reading through the whole thing, I remember sitting down and reading through the whole thing and thinking, this is so sad that I had to I was like, I'm such a depressive person. So we edited it way down just because it was just too much. Cause I felt like brevity needed to be part of what it was. Like, it's just not that long, because it is emotional and it's about us. And it's like, you don't need to know that much about us. This is enough. But what you're saying, Greg, I appreciate that. But, I think maybe here's another thing that we learn, or maybe to piggyback off of the last thing you just said.
Yeah.
We laugh a lot and we cry a lot. Again, they're not mutually exclusive. There's a lot of joy. There's a lot of beauty in this world that God has created, and there's a lot of suffering. And you should prepare yourself for both, because everybody is going to see good and beautiful things in this world, and you're going to go through hard things. Like, you're not going to be immune from the hard things of this life, but there's also joy in following Christ. It's both, and it's not one over the other, right?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. That is incredibly accurate and well said. Tristan, I want you to take the next few minutes and let's talk a little bit about this new ministry that you guys have stepped into. You stepped away from the pulpit and your role as a pastor, but you guys have stepped into a role now as directors of Smile Again Ministries that we talked about at the beginning.
Yeah.
So why don't you take, just for those who aren't familiar with it, tell us a little bit about it and what you guys, because I think you guys are talking about potentially making some changes with it, because it is a retreat center after all. And as I'm talking with Tristan right now, I have a view into the inside of the lodge, and it's absolutely gorgeous. But just tell us a little bit about that ministry, Tristan.
Yeah. So again, we live in the Brainerd Lakes area of Minnesota, if you're familiar with Minnesota at all. And we pastored in a small town up in this area. And so again, loved our church, and for a lot of years, we're really established. We've been here for a total of over 15 years total in this area. And so one of the things Jill and I were just personally wrestling with was just a season of change. We felt some change coming. And so after, I won't bore you with all the details, but after about a year of just praying and discerning, we really just sensed that it was time for me to step down from my role as a pastorate. I think part of that was, we went through personal tragedy. We went through a number of staffing changes after that as a church. We went through COVID, which was, for all you pastors out there, that was a joyful experience, wasn't it? And so we just felt like we had 7 years of just loss of a child and changes the church, and just God was stirring in our soul to do something else, but we didn't know what that was. And I'm much more a person of wisdom than a person of faith. I struggle to trust in Christ. And I just sensed like he was asking us, it's time to step down. And I was like, okay, God, I will. Just tell me the plan. And he said, trust me. And I said, okay, I will, but just tell me the plan. And after a lot of prayer, and Jill was super supportive. Jill has a lot more faith and trust than I do. we resigned this winter to our elder board and said, we're stepping out, and it's not anything about the church. It's just this season is coming to a conclusion for us. And so we stepped down, and I was super nervous because I didn't know, Greg, I don't want to be an idiot. I don't want to be the guy who's like, I quit my job and now what?
Right.
I've got all these children and I've got a family to take care of. And 24 hours later, we saw this posting online for Smile Again Ministries, which is 30 miles from where we live. It is a lodge and retreat center for parents who've lost children. And we thought, I think that's what we're going to do. And so we called the board, and this organization has gone through some changes in the last couple of years. It was originally started by a pastor and his wife, Pat and Judy Meisner. They lost a child back in the late 80s. They lost a daughter. And I think back then even there just weren't quite that many resources, and they continued to serve in ministry. And so later on in their pastor nonprofit ministry for families. And so they kind of built this from the ground up and have this property. It's about 15 acres and pretty rural Minnesota. It's on a little lake out here. It's a really beautiful setting. And Pat and Judy just did a great job laying this foundation for this ministry. And so they were kind of in between directors and looking for what was next. Pat and Judy retired just a couple of years ago. And so we just felt providentially this is where God's sending us. So we're kind of jumping in faith. It is, something we're just seeing what God's going to do. We're living out here currently and hosting families for the summer. And so we've had a number of families come through this summer and just trying to figure out what God's doing here. And we're excited about it and sensing that God has got something in store. You said we might be making some changes. One of the changes is we kept our house. And so we kind of will be commuting here throughout the winter. If you've been to central Minnesota, I'm not a native Minnesotan. It gets kind of cold here in the wintertime. I've
heard rumors of that.
Yeah, I've invited Greg to come up and visit us in January, but you don't really want to. And so we're just trying to figure out what the ministry is going to look like in the wintertime because it's just so remote and hard to host people. But boy, so far, just the people that have come through here, it's been a grace to connect with them, to walk with them, to listen to their stories, just to enter into their sorrow. And so we're in this new season.
Well, I'm glad to see you guys step into something like this because I think you've got so much to offer. You've been through so much, and you've got. It's obvious in our conversations because this isn't the first one that you have a heart for helping other people, and I think God is going to use you guys to encourage and to bless and to give hope to other people who have been through what we've all been through. So I'm excited for whatever the future is for you guys. And for if anybody who's listening would like to know more about Smile Again Ministries, you can certainly look them up. Google them, www.smileagainministries.org or .com.
Oh goodness, I knew you'd ask me that. I think I haven't even got the phone number memorized yet, Greg. So it's these details. Google it, right?
Exactly. And I'll have it under the description of Tristan's episode, so you can see it there if you want to learn more about it. And if you want to check out the book, again, it's called A Life After Death, and you can find it on Amazon. Tristan, it has been such a pleasure to have you as our guest. And I will say this before I let you go. For those of you who are listening and don't know, Tristan I don't think he mentioned this, but they are expecting a little boy around the end of September, I think. I think he said around the 24th of September.
Yeah.
So they're welcoming new life pretty soon.
Yeah. That's what I think. I might have said I'm a dad in my 40s now, so I just have all the dad dumb jokes. But this year we got a puppy and found out Jill's pregnant, and I quit my job as the 3 life decisions we've made so far this year. But so we're excited. we're expecting a baby boy. So we had 5 straight girls. Our youngest is a son, Elijah. He is spoiled rotten by all of his sisters who just dote on him constantly. So he'll get a little competition for the baby of the family coming in September. So
yes, he will.
Yeah. So
well, congratulations.
Thank you, Greg.
Yeah,
that's good.
Well, again, Tristan, thank you so much.
Yeah, Greg, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
If you find our podcast meaningful, we invite you to follow us so that you can automatically receive the latest episodes. Also, we'd like to invite you to contact us and talk with us about sharing your story on a future episode, because every story is important and matters to God. Please reach out via email at hope@emptychairendeavor.com. That's hope@emptychairendeavor.com. And as always, thank you so much for listening.